Okay, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Cypress testing within a React MV environment. So the topics we'll be covering today will be, well, what is testing and why do we do it? The types of tests that we'll be running into, what to write tests for, the pros and cons of test-driven development, popular testing frameworks for both React and Django, which is going to be the two main frameworks that we'll be utilizing in this course, how to install and configure Cypress to work with React, and then writing your first React Cypress test. And then we'll talk about how to run the test suite and what's so special about Cypress in comparison to other testing frameworks. Does anyone have any questions over what will be taught today? All right. Now, Cypress is going to be the test suite that we see following on from this moment on forward. With that said, it is very important that we understand how Cypress works, the different types of tests that we can write with Cypress, so that whenever you're working on an assignment and you see a Cypress test suite, you can go ahead and understand what the test suite's actually looking for. Or if you're working on your own personal project and you want to ensure that it has a test suite, because we all know that tests is important, you know how to create your own test for your own assignments to ensure the efficiency of your actual project. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. We've already talked about testing before. So can anybody explain to me what testing is in the reference of programming?
It is asserting that a given function or a given page or whatever will exhibit a certain behavior under a certain condition, and then finding out if that's true.
Nice. Awesome. And I like how you throw in the assert word in there, since we know when we write tests, asserting is something very important at the end, right? Okay, great. Yeah, it's essentially just that. We're just making sure that our program is actually doing what we want it to do. Now, that sounds kind of repetitive, knowing that we have the development server and we go and we click back and forth. But something important about testing, especially as our project gets bigger and bigger, is that we can't necessarily spend the time to reload the page, go over to the specific site, the specific URL, click on the same thing over and over again, and then maybe type in the same exact input on the search bar, and then wait to see if we actually get a negative response, whether our actual program is working correctly or if it's working incorrectly. All right, so that's where test comes in. Test is important because it's able to run all those things in the background, and it's able to do them a lot faster than what it would take me to go and type anything into the browser. And we'll see that today with Cypress specifically. Now, we've been working a lot with unit tests so far, right? And now we're going into the types of testing. We've been working a lot with unit tests so far. Can anybody explain or maybe give me a hint of an example of what unit tests we've been conducting or where we've seen unit tests before?
I can give an example.
Let's hear it.
So in our OOP, when you have to get a certain amount of students on a list, but for some reason there's never enough students on the list.
There you go. That's a pretty good example, right? That is a unit test, right? And we saw that in our test suite for our OOP assessment, for example, the example that Cody gave us, there was 23 tests, right? But yet, whenever we said, hey, run the PyTest module, or we wanted to run the test suite with PyTest, it was able to run all 23 tests within a matter of less than a second or two, right? Kind of depending on your computer performance. But that was definitely a lot faster than me running the actual video store, typing in, hey, I want to create a new user. These are all the parameters that I want to pass into the new user. Or do I want to check if it's unpacking? The behavior that the test suite was checking for was checking in a manner that was way, way faster than it would take for someone to manually go and check the functionality of that. Now, we've also seen it in our regular assignments, right? With JavaScript, we saw Jest running all of our unit tests. And with Python, we saw PyTest running all of our unit tests. Rather, it's been a while since we've seen a test suite. It's been almost, 2 weeks now since we've seen a test suite. So it might be a little bit hard to get back into test-driven development. But from this moment on forward, all of our assignments will have a test suite to get us prepped for assessment this upcoming weekend. All right, so now we talked about unit tests. And unit tests are basically testing functional components. They're testing something that is working uniquely within one component or uniquely within one framework, right? So in this case, something that tests is React and React specifically in a way that is maybe we have a function that maybe this function sets a color to the background of some specific component, depending on some conditions, right? And the function is supposed to check the conditions and then return the color that we're setting to that background. Now, we don't want to test the entirety of that. We don't want to test each individual condition. So instead, what we do is we write a unit test for each condition to ensure that the function is returning the correct color. So that's a unit test, right? It falls under functional. Now, if a unit test is something that falls right in between, right, only on one specific framework, so it only falls on the front end, and it's only conducting a functional component isolated call, what do we think an integration test might be?
I think it's testing like bigger scope, like functionality of your program doing a specific task or doing, yeah.
Great. Awesome. So it's going to be testing something a little bit bigger than a unit test, but not necessarily an end-to-end test, right? So an integration test, a perfect example of that might be an API call. Right? So this specific test is going to check a function that is not isolated to a framework, right? Because when we make an API call, at that point, we're contacting a backend server. Right? So an integration test will start in one side, whether that's the front end or the back end, and test its ability to communicate with the other framework, whether it's the front end or the back end. So in this case, we'll be writing it with Cypress. So we'll test if React is able to successfully send an API call to our server and return the appropriate response. Right? So that would be our integration test. So now, if we think about unit tests and integration tests, our unit test is staying isolated to one specific framework, and our integration test, well, we already know that it's going to be running an asynchronous or some sort of call that might have some sort of delay. So what does that tell me about speed? Which one is faster, unit test or integration test?
Unit test.
Yeah, unit tests would compile a lot faster because their behavior doesn't require to call any other server. While an integration test would take a little bit longer because now it's actually making calls to the API and it's ensuring the functionality of this one functional component. Now, with that said, if it's expected that it's going to run longer, it also might take longer to even build the test, which means that as a business or a company or as a developer, you're spending a considerable amount of time creating an integration test. And that means that you're, essentially the business is spending money in integration test while spending less money in unit tests. So unit tests are also cheap, but not very effective. While integration tests, they're a little bit more expensive, but not necessarily expensive. So we'll just say not cheap, but effective for site functionality, right? Because it's testing at least one side of our function, one side of our framework as an actual integrated test. Now we've gone over unit test and integration test, and this E2E stands for end-to-end test, right? And that's otherwise known as end-to-end. So what do we think end-to-end stands for?
The entire application.
Yeah, it stands for the
Front-end.
entire application, right? So an end-to-end is going to test the behavior, starting off with a browser being opened. That browser from then being open is going to visit our site. After it visits our site, maybe we wanted to click on a specific button. Maybe we wanted to type specific things inside of some sort of search bar and then click the search button. And then afterwards, we want to test if specific elements exist on the page, right? So let's say we just want to test the user experience. Let's say we're on Amazon, we're working in Amazon, right? And we want to create an end-to-end test for the user experience. All right, well, then I would test a Chrome browser opening up. Okay, the Chrome browser opens, that's good. And then I would test somebody being able to visit a specific URL for Amazon. All right, so I tell the test suite, hey, you're going to go to this URL. So it goes over, it takes the Chrome site there. Okay, now that I'm there, I'm telling the test suite, you need to click on this button for this item that says purchase. And then you need to click on a pop-up should pop up saying, would you like to proceed to checkout? Once that pop-up pops up, you can click on a button that says, yes, proceed to checkout, right? And then you have to assert that that button directs you to the checkout page. And then after that, you can move and you continue throughout the whole user experience until the entire purchase process is now over, right? So just there, I tested multiple API calls. I tested the ability to bill someone, and I tested my site's functionality to render things on the screen and my use state functions working correctly to create pop-ups or collapsing pop-ups. And that's where end-to-end comes in, right? So entire site functionality. So now with that said, these are very expensive because they take a considerable amount of time to build. And they are also very effective because they are testing our entire user experience. And it's essentially just like a person going to our site and actually trying to break it manually. But now instead of wasting time by having a person doing it because a person isn't as fast as a computer, we're telling a script and a program that is fully dedicated to try to break our site or do the steps that we're specifically telling it to do. Those are the three different types of testing: unit test, integration test, and end-to-end test. Does anyone have any questions over the types of testing? All right. If there are no questions for me, then I have a question for you guys, right? Let's see. Just so that we're not able to see our notes, what kind of test would I write if I were writing something that I want to test a function that's going to grab 30 Pokemon from the Poke API and it's going to return an array of 30 objects? What kind of test would test that functionality? Would it be a unit test, integration test, or an end-to-end test?
Integration.
Awesome. It would be
The
integration.
300
Why is that?
because it's making an API call.
Yeah, it's making an API call. It means it's contacting some sort of server to grab information. Awesome. So now let's talk about what to write tests for. Well, we covered that a little bit. But it is very common as a new developer that you start writing tests for everything, right? And you don't necessarily want to write tests for every single thing in your program, right? I don't want to test that there's going to be a body being rendered in React. If there's not a body being rendered in React, there's a huge fundamental problem at that point, right? But if we want to test things that are crucial to, one, the site's functionality, and two, the business itself, right? So now what do I mean by that? Well, later on, you'll get into a little bit, if you end up working as a front-end developer, more than likely you'll see something called the user analytics, where basically they start getting counts on like how often does a user spend looking at each specific component, right? Or how much time do they click a button depending on what color it is. And then they'll do tests. They'll put out different colors in different areas to see which colors get different people's attention, right? And there'll be very minute details. Maybe they're different shades, but that gets done all around it's called A/B testing. That gets around all in all sites and in all any big business will do that to ensure that they're maximizing their profits, right? They want to keep clients engaged, and in order to keep clients engaged, they have to make sure that they're giving you an interface that you would want to interact with. So with that said, maybe they find out, hey, this button needs to be this specific shade, right? Well, if somebody gets dictated that like verbatim, and it's that important to the business that it stays that specific shade, well, then that's something you would want to write a test for, right? You want to write a test to ensure that that button, every time it gets rendered, it is that specific shade of a color, right? Regardless of the conditions that are happening all around it. So maybe in your test suite, you want to try to purposely break it somehow. And if it doesn't work, then that means the test succeeds, all right? Now, you don't want to write a test for every single thing. You just want to do things for site functionality that are important to the site's functionality or that are important to the business itself. Now let's talk about some pros and cons about testing. What are some cons that people have experienced with testing so far?
Takes a long time.
All right, it takes a long time to write tests because not only am I writing a test, right? I have to write the successful behavior to pass the test. Then I have to write the test that tries to break it and so on. Okay, so it takes a long time. What else?
Understanding the errors.
Okay, so then there's errors, right? The errors that are coming back that sometimes you can't understand. All right.
Sometimes
It's just
I
like more
test.
code.
It's a lot more code. Got that, Robert? Yeah, it's almost duplicated code, right? I wrote the good thing, and now I have to essentially rewrite the good thing to make sure the good thing keeps doing the right stuff. And yeah, I get that. And Kate?
Sometimes I actually test the wrong thing instead of what I'm trying to test. So that takes a while to figure out too.
Yeah, there's that as well, right? Writing tests, it's the fact that it's happening in the background and that it's doing everything so quickly, well, it can make it hard to isolate where exactly it is that you're making the mistake within the test, right? And that's another problem. Sometimes it's the test that's wrong and not the product. So then you have to make the decision on the spot. So is this test the problem? Is this, or am I the one that's actually making the mistake over and over again, right? So there's all those things that are constant testing. Now, pros. So even though we just said, hey, we're writing these tests over and over again, we're essentially writing the code 2 times and it's very time consuming. The biggest pro of testing is that it's supposed to save us time in the long run, right? Not in the short-term run, because obviously we've interacted with tests in the short-term run up to this point. But let's imagine we're creating a product has very many faces. It has a multiple servers that it's communicating to, has backend frameworks. Maybe it has a separated database and the database is integrated with our backend. And we have to be able to talk to all of those services and to have someone manually test every single one of those functionalities. We create a brand new component. Well, how do I make sure that that brand new component that I created didn't just break everything, right? Well, which I've done before. I have a site or I'm working on a project. I've been spending 2 or 3 weeks on this project, and all of a sudden I create a component and I think, oh, well, I could just insert the component right here and everything should work. And then my entire site just completely breaks as soon as I introduce the component. Well, I still need the component, right? Or else I wouldn't have created it and added it. So how do I make sure that I can isolate where exactly the error is coming from, where I made the mistake? Well, that's where test comes in, right? Now I made all that trouble of rewriting tests, making sure the tests are conducting their proper functionality and they're returning me good results, that they're returning me specific error messages so that I can understand the error that's happening. Well, now I can isolate that behavior quickly and I can say, oh, well, this is happening because this is an object and it's supposed to be an array. And then I just make that quick change in my program and everything goes back to normal, right? So it's all about saving us time in the long run, not in the short run. Does anyone have any questions about why we write tests, the types of testing, and the pros and cons behind testing? All right, everything seems pretty straightforward. So let's go over into TDD. What is test-driven development? Can anybody answer that question?
It's writing the test before you write the actual program, code, app, whatever.
Right, so test-driven development is we have a test suite and we have to meet the requirements of said test suite in order to fix our program or achieve our program. So you write the test, you fail the test. That's our red light spot, right? Then you write the functionality, but you don't expect it to return the correct response on your first try. So that's our yellow spot. That's our yellow light. We're saying, okay, well, now I wrote a test and now I wrote the function for said test, but it's not necessarily returning exactly what I wanted to. Okay, well, that's my yellow light. And then finally, my green light is when I fix my function and it's actually meeting the requirements of the test. And that's all. And I just keep repeating that process over and over again. Where have we done that before? Or seen that process before?
Assessment 1.
Yeah, we did. That was all assessment 1, right? We just wrote the test, or we cloned down the assessment. The assessment already had a test suite. So the test suite was written for us. And we had to go in and actually pass each individual test one by one. All right. Great. So now let's talk about a little bit of the testing frameworks that are developed for React. And we'll start off by talking about, oh, hello. We'll start off by talking about Cypress or Cypress. So if we go into Cypress testing, we can go into component testing, I think. And then there's this get started. Okay, there you go. All right. So here it's already trying to give me a couple of examples. It gives me an overview. Gives me different things that I can do. Here I can see React component testing. This is probably the one that matters to me since I'm going to be working with React. And I can see a couple of examples. So here's some React examples. We can see that they are essentially importing a component named stepper. And they're telling it, hey, I want Cypress to mount this component named stepper. And then after that, they're checking that stepper, right? They're utilizing this get, and it looks like they're looking for this class named data counter. And then they're asking it if it has the text of 0. Right? They're also able to check what happens if they pass in props into a component. They were checking a component's functionality and ensuring that it's returning or at least containing the correct text within it. Right? There's even event handlers. We can see that Cypress is looking for an on-change event. So it calls the stepper component, gives it the on-change method or attribute, and then it has this click. So it's saying, hey, now I want you to click on this button that has the class of data increment, and that's going to trigger the on-change attribute. So then here Cypress is telling it, get the on-change attribute. And then it has been called with. So now I'm checking what it's doing. And I'm checking that its return is 1. All right, there's a lot of different tests that you can run with Cypress. And the impressive thing about Cypress, which we'll see here in a second, is that it's actually going to open up a browser while it's running your test suite. And it's going to tell you step by step what it's doing so that you can see where exactly it is that it's failing. All right, so that's Cypress. Another popular testing framework working with front end is Puppeteer. So now Puppeteer works almost exactly like Cypress. They're both end-to-end testing. And they're essentially just scripts that tell the browser what to do. So here we have an example. All right, so we have a Puppeteer script. It's working asynchronously. And it has to work asynchronously because, as we can see, it has multiple awaits. All right. So one, it's going to open up the browser. So there it launches a browser. All right, next it's going to open up a web page within said browser. So here we see browser, new page. Then we tell it to go to a specific URL within that page. We tell it what our viewport should look like. And we know what a viewport is now after we took our CSS classes. And then we go into the types. So it looks like it's searching that there is a search box underscore input class. And then it's going to type into it automate beyond recorder. So this is grabbing an element by a class and then typing this text into it. Okay. After that, it grabs the box link. It's telling it, hey, do not proceed until this actually exists. So once this exists and we've confirmed that this existed, this is confirming that it's existing. I want you to click on that box. And then we're going to wait for the page to do some stuff. And then afterwards, we can evaluate if the content of the text is what we expected it to be. So here we see our text selector. We're making sure that the content of the test is actually in there. And this evaluate is what returns a true or false. Okay. And then finally, we can see the console.log, which is telling us whether it's a full-time or not. It should tell us that it's a full-time. And then after that, it's going to close the browser, ending our Puppeteer function. So just in that small example between Puppeteer and Cypress, we can see that there's a huge difference, right? Puppeteer requires a lot more direction, a lot more, hey, you need to do this. We need to wait for this to happen. I want you to find, and it needs to be a lot more explicit. Now, some people don't like that because it takes more time and it forces you to write more code. While on the other hand, some people like that because that means it takes away your flexibility. Just the same thing as JavaScript and Python, right? I personally don't like JavaScript in comparison to Python, and I prefer writing in Python over JavaScript because of the fact that Python doesn't allow me to do weird things, like multiply a number times a string, right? Python will tell me, hey, you can't do that. You need to think about this and figure out another way of changing this method. While in JavaScript, I can definitely write that function out and it will return either a number or some weird string where it's interpolated to me without me explicitly telling it. So that could create some unexpected behavior. Well, that's what we'll see with Cypress. Sometimes you want to grab a specific class, but maybe you utilize the same name, or maybe there's multiple elements with that class. Well, now when you utilize the .get method, it can create some unexpected behavior. While in Puppeteer, I have to explicitly tell it whether it is a class or an ID, and I have to explicitly tell it how many elements will be grabbed whenever I run this get function, or I try to access the selector in any way. All right, so those are two frameworks that are utilized for React. Now we're going to talk about the two frameworks, well, that are utilized for Django. So we're going to have the Django test suite, which if we look at testing in Django in the Django project, this is going to be a little bit harder for us to understand right now. But we can see that it's actually using some form of PyTest, right? It's utilizing test case from Django. This is all going to come built in with the framework. While front-end testing does not come built in with the framework, Django does come with the test suite already built into it. And then if we want to create any sort of API testing, we can run Django REST framework API test. And here we can see that Django REST framework also provides us a sample of what we can use to test APIs. So now this is definitely a little bit more boring in comparison to our front-end testing, since our front-end testing will actually pop up a site, click through things, do X, Y, and Z. Our back-end testing will be more of a functional based test where it's going to pretend that it's sending a request and then it's ensuring that that request is getting the proper response. All right. So now we looked at a little bit of testing. we've seen a little bit of comparisons, and now we get to the fun stuff. We can go ahead and finally write some code. But before we start writing any code, I want to make sure that there aren't any questions regarding anything that I've covered. So at this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that we've talked about so far? Okay, I've also been running my mouth for quite a bit, so maybe we should take a break before we start going into any sort of writing test. All right, awesome. Let me go ahead and pause the recording. All right, welcome back, everyone. Recently, we just covered why testing, the 3 types of test, pros and cons, and test-driven development. We talked about some popular testing frameworks for both Django and React, but now let's actually go into some practical application, right? It's great that we talked about all the theory stuff, but now it's time to actually put it to the test. So let's write our first React test. Now, when we run this, we know there's going to be an H1 element that's going to represent V plus React, right? That's what we see every time we run the development server. So let's take it one step at a time. Can someone please walk me through creating a React project with a V development environment?
You're gonna want to do a npm create vi.
Okay, npm create Vite. Actually, let's just call it Rick.
And choose React
All right.
and JavaScript. And you want to cd into Rick Morty. And then npm install.
Okay. And then I can just run the development server, right? By running run dev. Okay, so here we can see our V and React environment, and we can see that there is an H1 tag saying Vite plus React. Okay, great. Well, that's the only H1 tag, so we'll utilize that as our primary example. All right, let's actually go through the process of installing Cypress. So we're going to go ahead and create a npm install Cypress -- save -dev. So now it's going to be saved into JSON and my development dependencies. All right, let's take a look at package.json now. In package.json, inside of my development dependencies, I have saved Cypress. So Cypress is now installed into my React project. Great. Well, Cypress is installed, but Cypress isn't quite running yet. I have to actually initialize Cypress. So in order to do that, I'll run npx Cypress open. Okay. And now, let me go ahead and do this. When I run npm Cypress open, we'll see this populate. It's going to ask me, hey, do you want to enter end-to-end tests, or do you want to enter component testing? But you can see that for both of them, I can't click them because it's currently telling me, hey, they're not configured. All right. So they're not configured. What does that mean? If I run a control C here, interesting. Let me try to do something like this. I apologize, everyone. It seems like I'm missing a step here.
Hey, Francisco, I don't know if it matters, but the dash dash save and dash dev or is on Cypress that have anything to do with it?
It's what?
The tags for install on the Cypress, the dash dash save and dash dash dev or
Uh-huh.
dash dev, I'm sorry.
What about them?
I don't know if you added those. I don't know if that was the issue.
No, I added them, yeah. But now you made me doubt myself. No, yeah, I added them. It just seems there's a configuration issue that was supposed to open up. Because right now we should have a cypress.config, but maybe I could create it manually. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go ahead and create a cypress.config.js file. So now the cypress config.js file, it needs to know a couple of things in order to be configured, right? We're going to go ahead and import this define config, and currently it's trying to bring it in from Vite, but this configuration isn't for Vite, it is for Cypress, right? As we saw in Chromium, oh, where'd it go? It ended. Okay. As we saw in Chromium, it's not running because it hasn't been configured just yet. Well, let's go ahead and actually create a configuration. So I'm going to export the function define config, and this function is going to take in an argument of the different things that I would like to configure. So one of them being viewport. All right, maybe I want to set the viewport width to be 1024. I want to set the viewport height to be 768. So there's my width and height of the project that I want to run. Did I really? Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so there's the project that I want to run. I'm trying to run this viewport 1020, and then I'm trying to run it at 768. Now, I'm also going to pass in this video argument saying I do not want it to take a video by passing in false. Okay. Well, now I'm going to create a test suite. I'm going to do this at the root directory. So I'm going to say make directory, and I'm going to call it end to end. And then within this directory, I'm going to go ahead. Ooh, and actually, this should be named Cypress. I apologize. Let me make a directory named Cypress, because this is how Cypress is going to find the test, right? So Cypress will, once we run it, it's going to look for a directory named Cypress. Within that directory, I'm going to tell it that there is a folder called end to end. So now we can see that Cypress has one folder named end to end. And then within that folder, I am going to create a Cypress test file. Okay, so I'm going to Cypress into end to end, and I'm just going to name a test file named 0 vite init -test.cy.jsx. And the important thing is to ensure that the very end is always test.cy.jsx. Okay, so now we can see a Vite has been created, all of this good stuff. Well, now we can tell Cypress where to find this test or where to apply this configuration to. So now on Cypress, what I'm going to do, or my Cypress config, is I'm simply going to tell it, hey, inside of the end-to-end folder, right? Because it's already automatically going into the directory named Cypress. So now I'm telling it to go into the end-to-end folder. And I'm saying within there, for every test, I want you to use the base URL of my local host, which if we ran npm run dev, it would give me localhost 5137. So let me copy and paste that there. And I want you to know that there are no support files, meaning there's nothing that you need to run or import prior to running this test. All right, so there's my configuration. Package.json knows about it. But now whenever I run this, I don't want to have to type anything crazy into my terminal. I want to, instead of writing all of the specific commands that I needed to run, I can create shortcuts utilizing scripts. So I can come over to my scripts within package.json. And here I can manually add the script. I can tell it that I want it to have a script for CY open. And what this is going to do is it's going to open Cypress. We'll leave it at that for now. So now we've done quite a bit of configuration. Right, first, we installed Cypress. After installing Cypress, we had to create a cypress.config. We are defining a configuration for Cypress, meaning that we need to export the configuration function so that Cypress can grab it and utilize it. From there, I am telling it that within the Cypress directory, there is a directory named end-to-end. And for every test located within end-to-end, it is going to automatically visit HTTP localhost 5137. It's going to have no support files, and it will have a viewport width of 1024, a viewport height of 768, and it will not take a video for any of the tests being ran. To avoid having to type in the same thing over and over again, of having to actually manually type npx Cypress open or having to do it with npm, I simply created a script shortcut so that I'm actually running it within npm. Right now, I can say npm run cy open, and that will automatically run my Cypress open. All right, I could name this just py, or for time purposes, I'm naming it cy open. So now let's see what happens when I run this command. So npm run cy open. Oh, I spelled that incorrectly. Okay, so it's able to recognize it. It opens up Cypress. Cypress is taking its time. And now it's telling me, do I want to run end-to-end test or do I want to run component testing? Well, the only one that I configured was end-to-end test. And now it's giving me a green light saying, hey, this is available for you to actually run the test suite. So now if I click on npm test, okay, so now it's telling me, hey, you wanted to run something on a server, but this server has been configured as your base URL, and we can't verify that it's running. What do you mean by that? All right. Well, is the server running? Let's see. What happens if I refresh my page? I'm getting an error. What's going on here?
Don't you just have to like npm run dev?
Yeah, in a separate terminal, I can run npm run dev, but I have to change directories. Okay, so now it's actually running. I can click on try again. It's able to identify it. I can click start the test. Well, once I click on start the test, this window will populate. And it's going to tell me, hey, this Cypress test has been identified. But there's nothing in it, right? It's not telling me anything. Well, that's because my test suite is currently empty. There is no test within it. So now let's go into writing our actual first test. And actually, before we move on into this part, does anyone have any questions over anything that we've done so far?
Yeah, I have a question. When I made mine, it automatically did make a configuration file and then also started a Cypress folder with a few fixtures and an e2e.js file. Would it be better to ignore those ones that were made and make the test.cy.jsx instead?
I don't know what yours generated for you, so I wouldn't be able to answer which one would be better without taking a look at it. But what I would say is to ensure that it has the basic default values, right? So for example, if it's going into end-to-end, make sure that it's going to this base URL and that it's not utilizing any support files. And make sure that it's not taking a video if this was populated automatically for you. Inside of Cypress, I would make sure that there's only one folder named end-to-end because anything that we use with Cypress will always be end-to-end test. And I would make sure that there's no other test suites except the one that you yourself have created. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a new world for me, so I'm gonna have to definitely do some more. But yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's go ahead and move on into writing our very first test. So now, just like in Jest, when we were utilizing it for our JavaScript test, we can describe. And in this case, we're going to say, this is our first Cypress test. Right, this describe block is then going to open up an it block, which is where the test will actually be ran. And here we'll just say visits home URL and ensures v plus react is within h1. Okay, so finally we open this up. And now here inside of our if block is where our logic will actually go. So first we need to tell cy where to go. Excuse me. So I'm telling cy where to go. Currently, Cypress is going to go to this URL. So where would I want cy to visit in this case?
URL.
Yeah, I would want it to go to the same exact base URL. So I'm just going to put a slash there. I'm going to say, hey, I want you to reference to the base URL by using this slash. Okay, great. So now that it's doing that, I can tell it, hey, I want you to get the h1 element. And I want you to make sure, so should, and then I can say contain, because this is the text that it should contain. It should be vt plus react. All right, so here's our h1 element, has v plus react. All right, let's come back over. Let's run our test suite one more time. Brings us here. I want to run end-to-end. If you're on WSL, you may have to run Electron instead of Chrome, because if you're running Chrome and you're on WSL and WSL isn't mounted properly, it may run into an error. So if you're running into an error trying to run Chrome and WSL, use Electron. Okay, so for me, I'm going to go ahead and utilize Chrome. I open up my testing. I click on the test. Now it's actually bringing up a test suite with an assertion. So here we go. So it tells me I'm going to, this is my first Cypress test. It visits the home URL and ensures that the v plus react is within an h1 element. That's my it block. So here's my describe block. Here's my it block. And now it tells me here's the body of the test. So first it visits slash, right? So at slash, nothing has rendered on screen just yet, right? That's step one. Then on line 2, I tell it to get the h1 element. So then once everything renders and the h1 element actually exists, we can see that it's highlighting it because it's grabbing that h1 element. And then finally, I can hover over my assertion, and then I can see that expected h1 to contain v plus react. And that's what it has. So my test has passed. Does anyone have any questions about this?
Is it okay? Do we have time to maybe look at mine and see what's going on with these defaults that came up?
I could definitely do that once we finish up the lecture, but not right now.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
Do we need a Chrome installed? And what is Electron? Is that a browser we have to also install?
That's a great question. So Electron is essentially, oh no, it's already running on Chrome. If I do close, there you go. So Electron is essentially a dummy browser that comes in with Cypress. And no, you do not have to download Electron. It will run automatically for you. And it's not a full-blown browser that you can interact with. It's just specifically rendered to be utilized with Cypress, right? While Chrome still allows you to have your dev tools and have the same functionality as what it would look like in Chrome. You do not have to download Chrome. You could just utilize Electron. So if I click on start with Electron, where did you go? Here you are. There's Electron populated. And we can see that it's giving me almost the same exact thing, except that it's running on Electron rather than Chrome. And it just looks a bit different. It's just a dumbed down browser that doesn't have the same capabilities as Chrome. Does that answer your question, Clarice?
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Do you mind going back to what you wrote on the for the test file?
Of course.
Okay. And then what did you do to run this? Or to make it? Yeah.
To run the test?
Yeah.
I have a script in package.json.
Yep.
And that script is cy open, which runs Cypress open. So and I just run npm run cy open, and that opens up Cypress.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. How did you navigate to the test suite? I'm assuming it's after I open up Chromium. Is this what you're referencing to?
Oh no, just the command you put in the CLI. Thank you.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, well now let's take a look at what happens if this test was to fail. All right, let's say that v plus react did not have that information. So let me open up app.jsx here. And instead of v plus react, maybe it just says v within it. Now let me run this one more time. We open up the test suite, want to run it on end-to-end on Chromium. Okay, well, when I click here, we can see it visits the one. All right, so here we go, step by step. It's telling me the test failed. Okay, why did it fail? So it's my first Cypress test. It's visiting the home URL and it's ensuring that v plus react is within an h1 tag. So it visits the slash. Great. That worked fine. It gets an h1 element and it seems like it was able to grab the h1 element, but then it fails. And it fails because it says, hey, the h1 element should contain v plus react. Well, if I view traceback, it's going to tell me some weird stuff. If I try to print it to the console, it will print to the console, but I can look here. I can see that the problem is that it's just simply not containing v plus react, right? The h1 element should contain v plus react. Okay, so now I know this test is failing. Let me fix it. Let me bring back v plus react. Well, now that I fix it, I don't want to rerun the entire test suite every single time I do a test. So I can specifically tell it to run this one test. Right, so then I run all my tests again within this one file. It's able to identify. Now it goes to the visit the slash. There's nothing on the screen. It gets my h1 element, and then it confirms that my h1 element holds v plus react. Okay, so this is useful for being able to see something on the browser, right? I can definitely have it do a couple of other things. And as I showed you guys on the demonstration, there's a couple of different commands that you can use other than just contain, right? But excuse me. The other thing that I would like to run over is speed-wise. Currently, right now, I have to open up a whole browser to be able to run my test suite. And I don't necessarily want that. All right. I'm going to go ahead and kill my Cypress. I have this running, but now I just want to run the one file. I don't want to see an example of it. I just want to see one file. I want to see this running in the background without me actually having to open up a bunch of browsers. Well, how can I do that? There's a command specific to React, to Cypress, where you can just run one file. And that is cy run, right? That's the name of the script that we're going to give it. But the command is going to be mpx Cypress run, and then we're going to specify which spec file to run. So now let's see what this command will do for us. I'm going to go ahead and say npm run cy run, and we can see this is running -- spec. So it's expecting me to tell it a file. All right, so I'm going to tell it that it's going to run the path to this directory. So I'm going to say Cypress -end to end. And I probably want to start here. And then I think, what was the name that I gave it? 0 beat -init test.cy.jsx. Okay, so now we can see that it runs everything within my terminal for that one specific test, right? Rather than opening up an entire browser and doing everything separately on a separate window and breaking it down step by step, it's still doing all of that. It's still opening up a browser and it's still walking step by step through our script. It's just that now, instead of me being able to see it and interact with it, it's doing it in the background and it's just returning the messages to me in my terminal. So now I can see that in my terminal, it was able to run this using version 13.4 of Cypress. It ran it on the Electron browser and it was headless, meaning that it didn't populate any browser. This was the node version that it used whenever it ran this test. It found one file. And here is where it searched to find this one set file. Then it tells me it runs this command and that the test of visits home URL passed. So then it tells me test, there was only one test. That one test was passing. It did not record a video because it was false. None of the tests within that file failed. There's nothing pending. Nothing was skipped. the duration of this test file being able to compile was less than a second. And the test file ran was vinit test cy. Okay, then it tells me once this is finished, this is the one file ran. It ran it in 285 milliseconds, and it was able to run the test file that I dictated in 285 milliseconds. Does anyone have any questions over this?
Is this for running like a limited amount of tests versus all of them?
Yeah, so this is for running just one test, right? I can make multiples. And let me see if I can make another file here. So I'm just going to have two files that run the same test, right? Now, currently in the last command, I specified exactly which one to run it on. So it's still running it on that one file, right? It's still able to collect only one file. It's not running it on multiple, it's running it on one test at a time. Now, if I were to do the same command, but not specify which file to look at, we can see that it runs two files, right? It runs my first one. It runs all the files within the directory because I didn't specify a specific file. I just told it the directory. So now it's running all of them as a background service instead of popping up a new browser. Does that answer your question, Josh?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
I had a question, and it's mostly just like, which one would you say would be better for like, regular use, to run Cypress in the terminal or to run it in the browser?
For me, myself, I would run it in the terminal first. And then if I get some unexpected behavior or there's a test that fails, then I would run it in the browser so that I could actually see what's going on. Awesome. Any other questions regarding Cypress?
Yeah. Can you give an example of like test cases with use state or use effect, the components or props?
Yeah, it's actually a really good one. Let's see. What can we do here? Oh, we have this button. Okay. And the button. Okay. Let's see what we can do here. So we can go to this test, and instead of getting this information, I wanted to get the button. So I'm going to utilize the selector, the button, and it should contain that count is 0, right? So let me make sure that that test runs correctly. Okay, so that one passed, right? It was able to count that the count is 0. But now let's see what happens if I run. So now it should fail, right? And let me run this on the browser, actually. Okay, so the first one's going to pass. We know that much. But if I run into, oh, what's going on here? Okay, so now I go into my second test and it's telling me what happened. So it looks like the failure happened at click the button. Ah, got it. Okay, so this is improper syntax. Okay, so now that I fixed it, we can see that it's running the test suite again. Now it fails again. Okay, so now it visits Cypress and it gets the button. Okay, so it's able to find the button. Then it clicks it. And we can see that when it clicked it, it turned it into 1, right? So it tells me before. So here's my state of my count before. And then it tells me after on the lower right hand, on the lower side of the screen. So it tells me before the click, it was 0. After the click, it turned into 1. Right? So the use state changes and it renders a 1 on the screen. Well, now when I run my assertion to get the button, we can see that that's the snapshot of the current document object model. And now it has 1. So when I run my assertion where I expect it to have count is 0, well, now it has count is 1. Right? Because that's what happened. It went to the site, it found the button, and it clicked it, triggering this use state function of set count, where it increased the counter by 1. So now count is not 0, it is 1. So if I come back over here and I change this to 1, and then I go back to Chromium, or sorry, I go back to my Cypress test suite, we can see that it's passing because again, it visits, gets the button, it clicks on said button, it shows me that before it was 0, and that after the click it was 1. Then it gets the button and runs my assertion that it is actually count is 1. Does that answer your question, Cody?
Yeah, that was actually some good information in there.
Hey, Francisco.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, if you wanted to click it 5 times, how would you pass that into like the syntax?
Well, I could probably do something like this. Right, and that should click it 5 times, so let me make sure that works. Let me go ahead and rerun this. Oh no. There you go. Okay, yeah. So hypothetically, like you just said, you want to click it 5 times, right? I could definitely write it individually over and over again. I can write this 5 times, but instead of rewriting this 5 times, I just made a for loop that will iterate between indexes 0 through 4. And then for every index, it's going to click the button, rounding it up to 5. So now we can see it visits, clicks 1 time, gets the element again, clicks twice, gets the element, clicks, and so on until the assertion where it says that count contain is count is 5.
It's interesting. I thought there'd be an easier way or something like that, but I mean, hey, I guess that works.
Do you mean like something like times it? Like k times 5.
Yeah, something like literally like just like or putting like 5 in the parameter or something. I don't know, but I mean that works too.
Yeah, let's see. Wonder if click button click.
So if you put number parameters and click it, from what I'm reading in the documentation, that chooses like the coordinates of where it'll click on the site.
Yeah, maybe there's a simpler way. Options. Now you got me going down a rabbit hole.
Sorry, no, not it's cool. It's cool. I
No,
can
no.
just look.
Right click, left click, debug. Okay. I'll find it, and then once I find it, I'll let you know. Of
Cool, thanks.
course. Any other questions?
It looks like there's something called multiple that might be a option you could pass in.
Let's see. What is multiple?
Never mind. Doesn't look like it's popping up.
Number times 5.
Never mind. I misread something. Don't just forget I said anything.
I'm already running it. Oh, nope, that ain't it. Maybe I can do it this. No, it's not like that. All right. Any other questions regarding Cypress? And you could definitely look up all these commands, right? So we can see something like Cypress commands. So here we go. We have all the commands in Cypress. Tells me where to visit, what request, and all that good stuff is. Here's all the different queries that you can also use to be able to grab different elements or information that you need. All right. If there are no other questions, let's go ahead and break off into, oh, is there another question?
Yeah, Fritz, in your app JSX, did you import something?
In app.jsx? No.
Okay. I was just trying to do it along with you, and I just wasn't getting the in the test. It's not getting the H1. Or you can just look back through the notes. I think I just missed something while I was following along.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have to check it out. Let me go ahead and stop the recording here. All right, welcome back, everyone. As I was saying, for the remainder of the class, what I would like on is for us to go ahead and work on the things that we've done up to this point, right? Everything that we've learned and actually apply it to create a small project. So you guys will notice that I named this the Rick and Morty, and that's because I found a Rick and Morty API. I myself am a big fan of Rick and Morty, so this was very interesting to me. So I'm going to go ahead and utilize the docs and see what we can do with this, right? It seems like we can get all the characters. That seems like an interesting schema here. So we could just go ahead and copy this and utilize this as our API. So my intent is to just make a site that will have a cards from Bootstrap, and it will show me each individual API, or each individual character for each card. So let's go ahead and create some stuff here. Let's I'm gonna have an H1 saying Rick and Morty. And this is definitely something that I would like for us for you guys to ask questions at any point. So please feel free to stop me at any point and ask me any questions. This is more of a review than anything. So if you have any questions, please make sure to ask. Okay, so we currently have our Rick and Morty. I can go ahead and go to main JSX, take off the strict mode. Okay, so now that I've taken off strict mode, I can make a function to get my characters. So const get characters. Now this is going to make an API call. So there's a couple of things that I need to install. One is I need to install Axios. And then I could import Axios. Okay, now that I have Axios, I can say let response is equal to await. Excuse me. And since I'm utilizing await, I know that this is going to be Jesus. I'm pulling an atom, losing my voice. All right. And since I'm utilizing await, I know this is going to send a request. So I'll go ahead and put my character here to send a request. After that, I'll console.log my response data so that I can work with set object. Now, this is something that I want to get triggered every time I load my application. So I'm going to place this inside of a use effect. All right, so let's take a look at what's going on. Refresh the page, go over to the console, and there's my results. So it looks like I want to go into response.data.results. Okay, that gives me 20 characters that I can utilize. Gives me Rick Sanchez. Let's see, for Rick Sanchez, it looks like it has episodes that I can find Rick Sanchez in. And I have an image for Rick as well. Okay, good.
Hey, Francisco.
Yeah.
Can you repeat what you said about the use effect and the get characters function in line 15?
Of course. Repeat what I said.
See what it's doing.
Gotcha. Okay, so this use effect is going to happen every time the page renders, right? And I want that to be continuous. Every single time I render this page, I want an API call to be sent. So because I want that to happen, I want to place this inside of a use effect so that it calls this function anytime the page is loaded. Does that answer your question?
Cool. Yes, thank you.
Of course. Okay, so now I have this characters array, this set characters, and what I can do is now I can go ahead and maybe grab myself a Bootstrap component. So let's go over to Bootstrap. And I like to use, I want React Bootstrap, sorry, not just Bootstrap. And I want to use something like cards. And I think that's one of the things that they have available. There you go, cards. This one should be good. Let me copy that and create a component. So component.jsx. Oh, this should be just be components. And then here I'm going to create a file named card.jsx.
Question.
Okay. Oh, there's a question. Go ahead, please.
Also with Anthony's question, if you didn't have a use effect there, what would happen?
If I didn't have a use effect, what would happen?
Yeah, on that. Yes, like if you didn't use the use effect and you just had it call the function.
Ah, I see. Okay. So your question is what would happen? Because it's still going to conduct my API call, right? Oh, as soon as I run my server. It's still conducting my API call. I'm just calling it here, right? And this is going to get in reference to something going on with the server and what's happening whenever I load my page, right? This is essentially going to get hosted within a server. So when I refresh this page, I would want this behavior to be guaranteed to me that it will happen upon mounting, right? Not only do I want it to be guaranteed to me that it will happen upon mounting, but I also want it to make sure that this mounting keeps track of it being completed, right? So now, even though I could just call it here and it's going to render it for me, I don't want to just rendering information from a regular call from the JavaScript. I want to make sure that there's a control variable that's telling it, hey, no matter what, or regardless of what other logic is going on, you will always render this information whenever the page refreshes. So this is more of giving us the extra control. Does that answer your question, Clarice?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so I have all my information, I have my characters, I created this card. And for now, let's say I'm gonna map through these characters. And what I'm going to do is I am going to render my card. I'll go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I just had sorry, we keep going back to the use effect and the API call.
Yeah.
So what is I guess, is there a trade-off with having an API call tied to like a button versus getting rendered on the page? Like if you make the API call upon rendering, does that slow the load time? But when you click the button, like if you're trying to pull up a specific character, it's faster because it's already there, versus if you use the button to make the API call, it'd be a slower, I guess, population with the data that you need.
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so let's see what we're referencing to here, right? Let's say we were talking an example where my content is, we've done the to-do list a couple of times, right? And we're familiar with the to-do list now. Now, when we created our full stack application during the full stack week, we know that all of the items belonging to a user and a to-do list are living within our database, right? So now if all that stuff is living within the database and it's living within some sort of Python server, how do I get that information to my front end? I would have to make a request, right? So I would have to make a request to the backend server to grab this information. So now the question is, when a user logs into my site, right, do I just want a welcome message and then afterwards have a button for them to actually get all of their list? Or do I want those lists to automatically populate for them once I have that information? That's where the trade-off comes in, is what makes the most sense to you, right? Do you want, as soon as the user logs into your site, for them to be able to see their list of items? If so, then you should be calling the asynchronous function for that API right away, as soon as the page renders. But if it's something like, hey, choose who you want to see the information of, right? So let's say we had a list of buttons, and then we could afterwards create a modal that populates each individual character, depending on who they select. Then at that point, maybe you just want each button, and then when they click on a button, that's when you make the API call, and the modal renders once the API call returns. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Of course. That might actually maybe a good exercise as well. Maybe we could try doing something like that if we have enough time. All right.
So real quick, is like an example of that. Like on Amazon.com, you have a search bar that you can search for other things, but on the main page, you're still going to get all these recommended items, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So if I go to Amazon.com, right? Oh, cool. A new episode of Invincible came out. Anyway, there's all these cards that render automatically, right? Well, all of these cards, I apologize, everyone. All of these cards that are rendering here automatically, they're not loaded by HTML and CSS. Like that's not part of their front end application. When I go to Amazon.com, the first thing that happens is an API gets sent, an API call goes out to grab the information for these cards and for this slideshow, right? Like if I were to log in on a different day or a different time, this slide might look different, right? So that means that when this API call goes out, it's essentially happening upon a use effect. And once the response comes back, that's when we start seeing these cards get rendered on my site. It's just that they're so efficient that it's happening so quickly that we can't even see it as the users. We think that it's all just already populating at once, but in reality, the only thing that populates is the template in the background. And once the API response comes back, that's when these cards get generated. Does that make sense, Andy?
Crystal clear. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Okay, so right now I'm getting an error. That's because I haven't installed React Bootstrap. So let me fix that real quick. Okay, I need this. So that should give me React Bootstrap. And then I believe there's one more thing that I have to add here. There it is. Okay, in main.jsx, I have to import the styling. And that's coming from my curriculum, from our curriculum. That's how we know that this is supposed to be in main.jsx. Okay, so now let's take a look at V. Let me run the server one more time. All right, so currently I'm not seeing any cards actually being rendered. I mean, Warhammer is a fun game, to be fair. All right, so now, let me see, which card was I using before? Okay, perfect. So I am using the correct card. I'm getting my response with my 20 characters. It's all coming back. And now I'm seeing that there's no cards being rendered on the screen, even though I'm mapping through my characters. Why is that?
Did you import card in the card.jsx?
Yes, I did. I do have card in card.jsx. The component's working correctly, right? But the content right now, what is the value of characters?
It's nothing because you haven't set characters yet.
Yeah, I have an empty array, so it's not rendering any cards, right? Instead of console.logging these characters, I can set characters to that response. And now when I refresh my site, it should map through them, but I have a syntax error. And that's why we weren't seeing these cards as well. Okay, so now I see my cards, right? And I see that there's 20 of them. Now it's giving me a warning here. It's saying each one should have a child, a key. So I'm just going to pass in the index to give it as a key. Okay, so now I refresh. There's no warnings, and I have all of my cards being rendered. Great. But I don't just want my cards to be rendered, right? I also want them to, I want my cards to actually show me something. So let's take a look here. So now I need to start passing in props into my card JSX. So I would obviously want to get a source for my card. I'm assuming the card title should more than likely be a character's name. Right, so here we can see that I have an image that's coming in for my response. I have a name that's also coming back. It gives me species. Oh, it doesn't have a description. That sucks. That would have been cool if it. It does have location. Maybe we could pass a couple of these attributes over to that. But here's the information that I have, right? And when I want my card to have access to it. So now I need to utilize props, right? To pass this information down to my card. So currently in app.jsx, I iterate through and I reference each individual index within the array as character. Go ahead, Robert.
Hey, I was just curious, where you map through your characters in app.jsx, is that where I guess you would normally do that for this, or would that be inside of one of your components?
I could definitely try to clean this up and maybe create like a header, body, and footer. And then I would probably put this within my body and leave this inside of header if I wanted to clean it up a little more.
Okay, no, that's cool. I was just checking. I get really caught up on the structure when I'm doing it. So I was just curious. That makes sense, though.
Okay, awesome. All right, so now I have this information. Now, how could I pass these props, right? Let's say we wanted to have the name, we want to have the image, and maybe we want to have species and status being passed in there. How could I do that?
You would have to use state for all of those variables.
Name, image, species, status. Okay, that's a good proposition. Why would I want to utilize use state for each one of these variables?
So that you can access them within your HTML.
Well, I think I can access them, right? I can console.log character. And let me create some fragmented tags real quick. Right, so if I go to refresh it, I can access everything individually.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I'm able to access everything. All right. So how could I pass these specific parameters from character over to the cards component?
Create
Can
an
you
object.
turn it in?
Go ahead, Claire.
Destructure.
I said make an object out of it.
Well, it's already an object, right?
Name like character, and then like use those keys. I don't know.
Ah,
That
got
might
it.
be
So you're
easier.
saying like pass in variables into it, like this.
That's props.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so now I'm passing in some props, right? So what would be, how do I grab the name value out from this object?
So it should be character dot name.
Right, I can do something like character dot name, right? And just the same, I could pass in character dot image, and I apologize everyone, but I'm gonna kind of hit the boost here because we have our retro. Okay, so now I pass in every single one of these variables over to the card. The card has access to them, but now I actually need to be able to grab them. So I'm gonna grab the name, image, species, and status. I believe that's everything that we had there. I'm gonna change the source over to image. I'm gonna change this card title over to name. And here, I'm just gonna simply put a UL element. And this one will have the species, with this one holding our status. All right, and all I'm doing is destructuring the props, the same props that I'm passing in from app.jsx, name, image, species, and status. I'm grabbing out of props by utilizing destructuring. From the props object, I'm grabbing the name, image, species, and status. And now my Rick and Morty project looks like this. I have my cards. Here's Rick and Morty. I have Rick Sanchez. He's human, he's alive. Morty, who's human and alive, and so on. All right, I can see the 20 characters that were provided to me. And then there's antenna Rick, which I have no idea what that is. All right. Does anyone have any questions about this quick review exercise that we just covered?
Can you just go over the API call one more time? I always get confused on those.
Of course. So the API call here. So we have this function that's happening asynchronously. It's called get characters. And I have to turn it into an async function so I can utilize the await functionality. By utilizing await, I am waiting for this response to come back from the server. So I send a request. Once that response comes back from the server, it gets saved under the variable response. I am then console.log. I am logging to the console response.data.results, which is what we are seeing as the 20 here in the list. And I apologize, everyone. Let me just get rid of this and this and this. There you go. Right, so that's where I'm seeing my 20 responses coming back from. Okay, so now I have my 20 responses. That's what's happening here. And then I'm setting it to the use state value of characters. So now characters is an array of 20 objects. That's what this function is going to do. It doesn't do it yet. It does it within useEffect. So useEffect is guaranteeing that it will conduct this functionality within mounting. And I know that it's happening within mounting because my dependency list is empty. So it will always happen upon mounting. Even if I have something in the dependency list, it will always happen upon mounting, but nothing else is going to trigger this function because my dependency list is empty. So when I click on the refresh button, the useEffect gets triggered. It gets the characters. Once I have my array of 20 objects being set, I then iterate through the characters by using the mapping function. I pass each individual key value pair as props into cards.jsx, I apologize. And then the cards function destructures the props object by grabbing name, image, species, and status. And then we're just simply placing each individual value wherever it is that we want it to be displayed. Does that answer your question?
That does. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Let me start.